Thank you so much for joining us today, Jeremy Sharon. You are the settlements reporter at Times of Israel, a longstanding reporter in Israel for a number of years, covering topics of religion and state, issues of what's going on in the what we call the West Bank, or the Judea and Samaria. And I wanted to bring you here today to talk a little bit more about that. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you.
Great. So really today, the purpose is just to give our audience an explainer about what are these settlements. And I wanted to start with a very simple question that I think sometimes confuses people. What is a settlement versus an outpost?
Okay, so a settlement is a dwelling, a town or city in the West Bank, which has been authorized by the Israeli government. It is considered a legal place to live for Israelis, and is connected to every aspect of Israeli infrastructure, electricity, water, and every other aspect of infrastructure in Israel. An outpost is considered is an unauthorized dwelling. It's where settlement activists have gone, established a town, well, I should say a small residence, without government authorization. In 1996, the government passed a decision saying that in order to establish any kind of settlement in the West Bank, you need the approval of the cabinet and the authorization of the defense minister. So an outpost lacks those permits and authorizations, and it often means that those towns won't have immediate access to electricity or water, and they'll have to find ways of hooking their residences up to those networks in a kind of informal manner.
So fascinating. Now, how many settlements are there?
There are, I think, about 135 settlements and around about 140 outposts. So the outposts are often very small, but they could usually there could be just a cluster of little houses. Sometimes they can be a built-up neighborhood of an existing settlement, and that neighborhood never got authorization. So it depends. Most of them are very small, but some of them are more established.
So what you're saying is that if somebody decides to build some houses for their children, grandchildren in one of the existing communities without permit, that is considered an outpost?
Well, you wouldn't be able to build. Usually, that it doesn't. An output in a neighborhood, it would usually be a more formal kind of construction process, even though it hasn't been approved. But yes, that is the case, and some kind of like far-flung neighborhoods of certain settlements, the construction is done a bit further away from the settlement. It might still be within the jurisdiction of that settlement, but it hasn't received permits for construction. So that would be considered an outpost, yeah.
Interesting. Now, how fast is the Jewish settlement community growing? And has it mattered which leader has been in charge in terms of seeing that community grow?
It depends exactly who you ask. According to the Settlement Council of Judea and Samaria, they told me recently that it's about 7,000 people a year, and most of that is natural growth. The Peace Now organization has figures which give about 10,000, an increase of about 10,000 people a year. In terms of who's been in charge politically, for most of the last 20 years anyway, it's been a right-wing government. And the truth is that the settlement population has grown at a pretty stable rate. It hasn't really differed in terms of who's been in charge politically.
Interesting. So what is the distinction between East Jerusalem and the West Bank when we talk about settlements? Because, by different numbers, you can have around 450,000 residents of the West Bank, or you can have close to 700,000 if you're counting East Jerusalem. So why do we differentiate?
So Israel, in 1980, the Knesset passed a law called the Jerusalem Law, which annexed East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem was the area of Jerusalem which was captured by Jordan in 1949, and which Israel took control of during the Six-Day War in 1967. So that's all the eastern neighborhoods, which include Palestinian neighborhoods, and over in that area, Israel began creating neighborhoods And there is now something like 200 to 250,000 Jewish Israelis living in those neighborhoods of East Jerusalem. Because Israel passed the law in 1980 annexing East Jerusalem, that means that Israel doesn't consider the neighborhoods in East Jerusalem to be settlements. It considers them to be part of Israel, to be fully part of Jerusalem. Whereas the international community does not recognize Israel's annexation and considers all of those residents of East Jerusalem neighborhoods to be settlers.
Interesting. Now, the U.S. actually legalized the settlements under former U.S. President Donald Trump. So how does that impact Jerusalem, and what does that really mean for the settlement community?
So during the Trump administration, the State Department, led by then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, reviewed the issue of the legality of the settlements and came to a new determination saying that settlements were not per se illegal, differing from a lot of other opinions in international law. What impact does that have? The impact is not immediately clear, mostly because the issue of the settlements has not usually been discussed on the ground in a legal manner. The issue of the settlements is more of a political concern, where Israel asserts its right to parts of the West Bank, or says that Israel has a historical right to the entire West Bank, as known as Judea and Samaria, because it is part of the broader land of Israel as determined in the Bible. And that is where many Israelis see their right to live in the West Bank as deriving from. But the Palestinians obviously would like large parts of the West Bank to be part of their state, and see the settlements as making it more difficult to create a two-state solution, because it's harder to separate the two entities of Israel and a future state of Palestine if the two populations are intermingled too much. So in terms of the effect of the State Department's determination, before the State Department made that determination, Israel was building settlements, or I should say expanding settlements. And the situation has remained the same. Israel continues to expand some settlements, and I don't think there's been a huge impact. So it's the issue of these settlements is less of a legal one in many respects and more of a political one. And until that political issue is resolved, then that's the most critical aspect.
Makes sense. So has Israel ever dismantled settlements? We talk a lot about building them. What about taking them down? And perhaps speak to Gaza in this as well.
Sure. Yeah, Israel has dismantled settlements 3 times in its history. Israel created some settlements in the Sinai Peninsula, which Israel took control of after the Six-Day War. There was 18 settlements in the Sinai Peninsula, and when Israel made peace with Egypt in 1979, part of the deal was that Israel had to evacuate all of the settlements and remove all of its troops from Sinai. So Israel removed all 18 settlements from the Sinai Peninsula by 1982. In 2005, Israel carried out the disengagement from Gaza. There was several Israeli settlements in Gaza at the time, numbering about 8,500 people, Israeli settlers in the territory, and Israel unilaterally agreed to remove all of those settlers from the territory and took them all out in 2005. And actually, at the same time, as part of the disengagement, Israel also evacuated 4 settlements in the northern West Bank, and that was part of confidence-building measures with the Palestinian Authority to advance the peace process. And they evacuated 4 small settlements in the northern West Bank, which, because of their proximity to Palestinian cities and other population centers, were considered to be a particular problem in terms of creating a Palestinian territorial contiguity in a future Palestinian state.
Interesting. Now, the settlements, as you mentioned before, are actually, we call them settlements in the mainstream media, but really this is the biblical heartland. This is part of the biblical map of the state of Israel, much more so even than Tel Aviv, for example. So tell me, from your perspective and what you know, do the settlements belong to the Jews, and what arguments can be made in that direction?
So it is the Judea and Samaria are certainly very much connected to Jewish history and are part of the landscape where the forefathers of the Jewish people were present in ancient times. You've got the city of Hebron, where you've got the tomb of the patriarchs, and there's a very famous biblical account where Abraham bought a plot of land in Hebron in order to bury his wife, and subsequently he was buried there, and along with the other forefathers and matriarchs. So you've got that aspect. You've got lots of other biblical sites. The tomb of Joseph is in the northern West Bank in Samaria. You've got ancient altar sites from the time of Joshua, and obviously the entire area is replete with Jewish history. So as one university professor once said to me, if you don't agree that Israel has any history and historical right to the West Bank, then Judea and Samaria, as many Jews in Israel call it, then that means you don't agree that Israel has any right to Tel Aviv, because this is despite the current political borders or political demarcations, the entire area of what is the land of Israel is associated with the Jewish people going back 4,000 years. So Israel has a very good historical claim to the region and to be present in the region. Whether or not that necessarily fits with the political reality of 2021 is a different question. It's possible that two people.
2022.
2022. It's possible that two peoples can also have legitimate claims to the same area, and that two people might both have legitimate rights and also have legitimate grievances. The way that gets resolved in the future, might have to be part of it. There might have to be a compromise between both peoples, and both peoples might feel that both of them have been served an historical injustice. But the way, in order to progress and to move out of what has been, I guess now officially a 70-year conflict or 75-year conflict, but dating back, to the end of the 19th century, in order to get out of what is, I guess, over a century of conflict, both people might have to accept and that they all have to suffer an historical injustice in order to move past such an enduring conflict.
Incredible. Okay, wonderful. Well, is there anything else that you feel that our readers should be aware of or should know that we didn't talk about during this conversation when it comes to really understanding what we mean when we say the settlements? Okay,
I would say one thing. Let me. If I've got 5 minutes, I'll say a couple of things. Many of the settlements and many of the settlers, we talked about 450 to 500 Jewish settlers in the West Bank, not including East Jerusalem. Many of them live close to what's called the Green Line. The Green Line is the boundary of the West Bank and Israel, which is the old 1949 armistice line between Israel and Jordan. So many of the settlers live close to that line. And in a future, if there were to be a future peace agreement with the Palestinians, it would be possible to include those large settlements where the majority of the settlers live into the borders of Israel, without leaving too many Jewish settlers in what becomes the Palestinian state. So although the settlements are considered to be a very big problem in terms of coming to a solution with the Palestinians, there are ways in which that problem could be minimized and the two sides separated in a way that doesn't leave too many settlers on the other side. Well, I would say one other thing in that Israel has a minority, an ethnic minority of Arabs. About 20% of Israeli citizens are Israeli Arab citizens. And often when people talk about the settlements and they say, well, the settlements are an obstacle to peace, it's because they're working off a basic premise, which is that if if Israeli Jews live in the West Bank, then the more Israeli Jews live there, the harder it becomes to make a Palestinian state, because you can't separate the two sides. But, no one talks about separating Israel from its Arab citizens. That would be considered racist. And in fact, there are racist parties in Israel who want to remove Arab Israeli citizens. And most of those politicians and that party is considered to be racist. So the basic assumption is that, well, if Jews living in the West Bank is intolerable for the establishment of a state of Palestine. But that is coming off the premise that the Palestinians are out. Well, is that really a legitimate premise in the 21st century, that Jews can't live in the state of Palestine? I think the Palestinians would often say, yeah, well, the Jews would be welcome to live in a new state, and that wouldn't be a problem. But in reality, the security of Jews living in a future state of Palestine would be extremely tenuous, and the fact that is the situation, that Jews could not, the security of Jews could not be guaranteed in a future state of Palestine is problematic.
Got it. And that's definitely something for people to be thinking about, I guess, as we're moving forward with negotiations. U.S. President Joe Biden was just in the country, brought up the two-state solution many times during his visits, although he also mentioned that he didn't think that was something necessarily on the table for today. Well, Jeremy, Sharon, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been really eye-opening and very effective, I think, in explaining to people what we are talking about when we say the settlements, and hopefully can give people some perspective when they're reading our own publication, All Israel News, and also when they're reading mainstream, New York Times, CNN, and other publications referencing the settlements. So thank you so much for, and of course, Times of Israel, where Jeremy Sharon writes, if anybody wants to read his material. So thank you so much for being with us today, and have a wonderful day.
You're welcome. It was great to be with you, Mayan.